Happy New Year and welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. If you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more colors in our political rainbow than red or blue, welcome home. Now, among the cast of characters who emerged in last year's election, few were as memorable as Elon Musk, who appeared alongside Trump at numerous events, revealing both his penchant for right-wing politics and his midriff, unfortunately. With the election over, Musk has decided to take his game of weirding out voters across the pond to Germany, where his recent endorsement of a far-right political party there has created a bit of a stir. That being said, will his presence have the same impact and potentially give him the same power over public policy there, or no? We're going to talk about that in this episode. But first, Shawn, I think we should start off with a Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, I know a lot of podcasts like to do a kind of year in review at the end of the year, but no thanks.
No thanks. Yeah, that's fine.
Right.
I'm good.
yeah, same. So I know topic of today is Elon Musk. I think before we get into his involvement in Germany's upcoming snap election, we ought to talk about a recent story that broke about Elon Musk having an online alter ego. Have you heard about this or no?
Yeah, I have. I've seen a lot of things on Blue Sky about this other persona that he's taken on to kind of communicate and validate his opinions.
Yeah. No, so for you, if you haven't heard about this, Elon Musk has an alter ego named Adrian Dittman, who is overly flattering of him. One post I read referred to Musk as an amazing father who gets lots of sex. Just let that one sit. I think at this point we can say that the only thing bigger than Musk's fortune is the hole in his heart. Because who in God's name sets up an online imaginary friend to say nice things about you?
You know, it really does speak to the personality that people have seen from him. Especially over the last year when he got more involved in U.S. politics, obviously got involved with the Trump campaign. You could see the insecurity with him, that he needed validation. And if he wasn't going to get it from other people, then he was going to give it to himself in some way. And what I think is interesting is that there was an article in The Verge that pointed out to screenshots that were posted on 4chan that showed that this account had Twitter or X admin permissions. And they were like, this is the smoking gun that points to him being Elon Musk.
I saw that. I'm just trying to figure out, are we at the, playing the fiddle while Rome burns phase of American history, or the appointing your horse to the Senate one? I'm not 100% sure, but I'm feeling like we're going to get the answer this year. Moving beyond Musk's imaginary friend, late last month, as himself, he published an op-ed in Germany's Welt am Sonntag, apologies for my accent there, endorsing Germany's far-right political party Alternative for Deutschland. And in the op-ed, he referred to AfD as the country's last spark of hope. Now, this prompted a lot of backlash in Germany. Friedrich Merz, leader of the Christian Democratic Union, Germany's center-right party, called the endorsement presumptuous, and the editor of the paper in question also resigned in protest. Now, AfD is a party that in many ways mirrors the MAGA movement here in terms of policy. So both in their embrace of nationalism and hardline stances on immigration, but also in their ability to court controversy. And so it's really not a huge surprise that Musk would align himself with a party like this. Now, what I found most interesting as I was digging into the story is not just the similarities that AfD has with the modern day GOP in terms of policy, but also in terms of origin. It started in 2013 as a Eurosceptic party, and its platform was largely based in opposition to bailouts during the Eurozone crisis. So at the time, Germany was the strongest European economy, and there were a lot of weaker economies that were really struggling. Greece, one in particular, that needed bailouts in order to stay afloat. This was a big problem for many in Germany, and this is where AFD really found its footing. Now, the interesting thing I saw there was its roots in the financial crisis, because, of course, the Tea Party really came out of the same environment, right?
Hmm. Yeah, so the Tea Party started around 2007, going into 2008. A lot of people look back and they think of the Tea Party as a referendum on President Obama, but actually started during the Republican presidency under Bush. And same thing, it started in response to what the public officials and the citizens, the organizations that spearheaded this movement looked as out of control government spending, high deficits, high debts at a time when America was dealing with its own financial crisis. And a lot of people were dealing with their own financial issues that Washington wasn't addressing. And so it started as this populist movement that had public officials like then U.S. Congressman Ron Paul behind it. But between 2008 and 2010, you started to see these far right individuals within the Republican Party co-opt the Tea Party movement. You started to see more and more organizations kind of take it on, but these organizations and these public officials started to talk about more than just fiscal responsibility. All of a sudden, you're hearing things about illegal immigration and voter ID and issues that really weren't at the forefront of either major party at the time. And in 2010, you saw the red wave, big red wave. Republicans took over a lot of seats in the House. You started to see these Tea Party candidates come up through the primaries, by the way, and then win their seats. And gradually, this movement was able to kind of not completely, but have enough influence in the Republican Party to sway that party's policies and the platform. And I think one thing of note, I think it's very interesting for listeners to think about when we think about our own political system is that they did polls, various polls in 2013 about public support for the Tea Party. And what they found was only about 10% of Americans actually identified with the Tea Party movement. And yet you see all of these public officials who were elected, and you can connect that to data from organizations like Unite America that have found that because of how uncompetitive our elections are, ultimately 7 to 10% of American voters actually decide election outcomes in this country, and you saw that with the emergence and growth and success of the Tea Party.
Well, that statistic's really interesting because, again, just to repeat what you just said, the Tea Party's success was largely based on its ability to go into partisan primaries and win there. And as we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast, primaries offer a way for a very small group of polarized voters to have outsized leverage. Because if you're ultimately able to sway the Republican primary in a red leaning district or state, or the Democratic primary in a blue leaning district or state, you've effectively won the general election via that primary. Now, Germany's setup is just a little bit different. So, Germany uses a system of proportional representation, which effectively means that a party's share of seats in parliament is equal to their share of the popular vote. And the interesting thing with AFD is their level of support was maybe a little less. So in 2013, they got a little under 5% of the popular vote, which was below the threshold to enter the Bundestag. So they won no seats. In 2017, their support nearly tripled to just a little over 12.5%. That won them 94 seats, made them Germany's third largest party. But the interesting thing here is that while they gained a presence in parliament, they didn't dominate half of the agenda. I think, like we saw with the Tea Party as it entered into the fray, and now with the MAGA movement as well. So where AFD really got a slice of parliament, but not all of it, effectively what the entrance of this new faction of the GOP did is it started this ideological civil war that we saw first with the Tea Party ousting a lot of traditional conservatives, and now really what we're seeing with the MAGA movement.
Yeah, I feel like if our system looked a little bit more like Germany's or some of these other parliamentary systems, what you could have seen in around 2008 is that group of Tea Party movement people, the people who really started the movement, got to break off of the Republican Party and start building their own sort of party or movement that had a grassroots support behind it. But that's not possible in our system because our system endorses two major parties. These are your choices, Republican or Democrat, and those are your only choices. And it really does start with these primary elections, which I think another important point to bring up about the primaries is that you could have special interest groups, moneyed interest groups, who are capable of mobilizing voters, have tremendous influence over who ends up winning these elections. And you saw that with the Tea Party. While a lot of candidates and officials who spoke on behalf of this movement talked about how there's no central organization, no central control of the movement, it was a movement of the people, by the people, and it was this big populist movement. What was discovered was that actually there were people who were funding it in the back. That's when people started to hear names like David and Charles Koch for the first time. Even though they ran the nation's largest corporation, it's funny how no one heard those names until all this stuff with the Tea Party movement came out. You do see this interesting contrast between how the systems in America work versus how they work in Europe and Germany.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, now so right now with the upcoming election in February, AFD is polling around 20%, and so you could generally assume that if polling holds consistent, that's roughly the number of seats or the percentage of seats they're going to hold in the Bundestag. Now, that will make AFD at least one of Germany's top two largest parties, but it won't necessarily give them the same influence you might see if you came to dominate one of the two major parties in the United States. So, one of the things that's happened in German politics over the last decade with the rise of AFD is the use of what's referred to as a cordon sanitaire. What that effectively means is that all the other parties have just decided not to work with AFD at all. So AFD is kind of sequestered away. And instead, they've agreed to all form coalitions with each other to push policy. So AFD's had very limited influence over German policy as a result. Now, part of that is cultural. Germany obviously has a very rough history when it comes to far right politics. And so they're a little more skeeved out by some of the language AFD is using than we are here in the United States, with some of the language coming out of some of the folks in the MAGA crowd. And so they haven't had the same ability to push policy forward. What is interesting, though, is that absent the ability to push forward policy, they've used a lot of non-traditional channels to elevate their presence. So much like you see with some of the rabble rousers in Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and so on, they've really used their presence in Parliament more as a way to elevate themselves in media, both traditional media and non-traditional media as well, and really build up their following that way. So even though they might ultimately become Germany's largest party in terms of share of seats, that still may not give them the ability to shape policy due to the way German politics is structured. Now, getting back to something else you said, though, about wealthy donors coming in, this is another area where I think the payout in Germany might be far different than the payout in the United States, because Musk has invested 243 million on the last election cycle. And so this has given him a front seat in Trump's transition. So he pretty much lives at Mar-a-Lago now. He was on a call that Trump had with Volodymyr Zelensky. And he also notably has promised to bankroll primary challengers to any senator who opposes any of Trump's cabinet picks. So this investment has given him outsized sway over the the GOP and buy that outsized sway over two branches of government going into 2025.
You also see this with, talking about his influence, and now and in the immediate future when it comes to his involvement with MAGA and Trump, uh, and the role that both moneyed interest and primaries play is the fact that he has even threatened sitting members of Congress, say, hey, if you don't go along with Trump, you don't go along with our agenda, I will fund a primary challenge against to get you out so we can get someone who's more friendly to us in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we got to pause here because whatever side of the aisle you fall on, the fact that a billionaire who makes a lot of money off government subsidies and government contracts can come in and effectively take over one of the two major political parties and effectively take over the White House and Congress by that should be really troubling. And doing so overtly. This could just as easily be, Mark Zuckerberg on the left or somebody else endorsing left-wing candidates. And so I think that should be troubling because ultimately it's going to be who has the most billionaires. And if it comes down to that, then we have a system effectively where people are literally and legitimately buying government and by that buying policy as a result. And that's a real problem. And this is where I find the whole issue of campaign finance reform lacking in teeth, right? Because in a lot of ways, like I've been doing a lot of thinking as we've been prepping for this episode. And, as I've looked globally, and this is something I did years ago. When I first got into electoral reform, it was the result of me actually looking into campaign finance reform. And what you see globally is there is no consistency between the strength or strictness of a country's campaign finance laws and the effectiveness of its government. So, two of the top ranking democracies in the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, that's Denmark and Sweden, have looser campaign finance restrictions than the United States does, right? No consistency. And so you have to ask yourself, do these laws actually prevent corruption? Do they actually prevent big money from influencing politics, or are they a response to it? Because I'd argue it's the latter.
I would also argue it's the latter. And when you compare these developed democracies and the role that money plays in it, again, I think it cannot be stressed enough how when you're able to use your moneyed influence on a low turnout election to ultimately influence the entire outcome of that election, that is what people need to pay attention to. Because at a certain point, no matter how much money you dump into an election, it's not going to have any more impact. There's a certain threshold in which it's no longer going to mean anything. It's just going to be wasting and throwing money at it. But it's where that money is going to and where that money is going to have the most impact. And we already saw in this last election, Kamala Harris had the most money, had spent the most, raised the most, still lost, right? So on a national scale, having all this money necessarily may not matter. But when you look at these lower turnout specific primary elections, where only 10 to 15% of the population shows up to vote in them, that's where your money is going to have the most impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a lot easier to buy off a smaller number of people.
Yeah.
And even you could say this about the presidential election, where ultimately that spending wasn't designed to win over the whole country. It was designed to win over just enough voters in a few key states to tip the scales. And I mean, you could argue it worked. To be frank, I still think it was the economy. But I think it does help to focus people on what issues we should be paying attention to, because I think there are many of us who are dissatisfied with the state of government. We're dissatisfied with the two-party system. And will look and say, oh, well, if we just overturn Citizens United, or if we just implement this law or that law, it's a game of whack-a-mole. And it's been that way since the dawn of campaign finance regulation. But I think if the history of campaign finance law tells us anything, it's that any campaign finance regulation will be thrown to a legal buzzsaw on First Amendment grounds.
And we're about to see this in Maine. because the main voters just passed a measure to limit contributions to a super PAC to $5,000 per individual per election cycle, and it's the most stringent regulation on contributions to a super PAC that's ever passed in this country, particularly post Citizens United. And there's already legal challenges to it. It's already going to go through the courts. It's probably going to find its way up to the Supreme Court. But yes, any effort to take on campaign finance regulation is going to find itself in the courts, and it may be doomed from the start, depending on what it is.
Well, here's the thing, right? The first campaign finance law with teeth was FICA, which was implemented in the 70s after Watergate, right? And that saw a challenge in the Supreme Court, and that resulted in a limit on contributions to candidates, but not to parties. And so then you had soft money enter into the situation. And then you had McCain-Feingold, which tried to limit the influence of soft money. But then that turned into PACs and super PACs. And then you had Citizen United, which pretty much destroyed any concept of transparency, any sense of limitation on the influence of money in politics. And so it's like they every time they create a regulation, there's another loophole or there's another court case. There's no way around it. And so I think if we go back to Germany, right? We go back to the system of proportional representation. What we see is, yeah, you know what? You can go in, you can influence a particular segment of voters, but it's not going to have the same outsized payout, right? You can't buy 10% of voters and turn that into 100% of government. You can buy 10% of voters and get 10% of government. And I think if we just unwind this a little further, something we've said time and time again is that the MAGA movement is part of the Republican Party. It is not the whole Republican Party. And the Republican Party is part of the American electorate. And it's not half, it is 25% of the American electorate. So MAGA movement at best is probably 15% of voters. That's diehard MAGA. And then you've got your regular Republicans, and you've got your right-leaning independents, and so on. But I think this just goes to illustrate that the system we have allows for people like Elon Musk to come in and have this influence, makes it easier. And there's an antidote.
Yeah, and it definitely makes it easier for the minority to have an outside influence, regardless of what side of the aisle you're talking about. Because in this country, you could start a movement to essentially try to infiltrate and take over a party. And it's either going to be successful or it's going to flounder completely, depending on the strength of that party. So with the Republicans, we saw that the Tea Party was able to easily infiltrate it, and because they were able to take over enough of the Republican Party, they were able to influence policy. But I would argue, based on those 2013 polls, that Occupy Wall Street probably had just as much support as the Tea Party movement nationally, but they didn't take over the Democratic Party. Our revolution, the Bernie Sanders movement, it probably has 10% or more support nationally, but it's not able to take over the Democratic Party. So it is interesting to see the contrast between those things, but also how a system in Germany would allow our revolution or Occupy a Wall Street to have the same voice that AFD was able to get in that government if we had that same type of system, but we don't. We have a system where you're either Republican or you're either Democrat or you're a wasted vote. You're a spoiled vote, and your vote doesn't matter.
And I think the other thing I would say too is that, if you've listened to this podcast, we're not MAGA, but we're also not against MAGA being heard.
Right.
The reality is that the MAGA movement is the result of the Tea Party movement not feeling heard. And the Tea Party movement is the result of some other faction not being heard. And the more you allow these voices to be heard earlier, the more they have a chance to impact policy in some way and potentially steer us away from extremism. But as it stands, I would say part of the reason people embrace right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism is because of an inability to be heard through legitimate channels.
In a healthy democratic system, as you were saying, even a small percentage of the population can be heard. They could start their own movements and be able to get a few seats in Congress or in a parliament, whatever it is, and have their voices heard and be able to expand from that. But I wrote about this earlier this week about how in the current system we have, in a winner takes all system, you can't have that. And you see this in the speaker fight right now. How there's a lot of Republicans who want to pressure Mike Johnson to never work with Democrats again, because that's how this system was designed by the parties to operate. It's us versus them. Now that we have the majority, no matter how slim it is, right? How dare you work with Democrats to do a funding deal to keep the government funded, right? So people understand the House of Representatives is going to be split pretty much 50-50. The Republican majority is 50.6% of the House. This is the most divided Congress we will ever have. In a healthy democratic system, that would lend itself to coalitions on both sides being able to form and come to solutions and find agreement on them. But that's just not how our system has been designed. A system that just elevates winners and losers between two sides.
And Shawn, we are going to end it there. Once again, nailing the dismount, first episode of 2025. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics. If you like this episode, please be sure to subscribe. Please be sure to rate it, review it, and tell anyone you think might need to hear it too. We want to get the word out. Theme music for Middleweight Politics, courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you once again for listening, and stay purple.